Unfortunately, I got here a little late to do any kind of tutorial or anything before the sun was coming up, so I had to get this shot first. But let me explain what I was doing. I've been wanting to photograph the Richmond skyline for a couple of years now. It's been 5 to 7 years since I shot it last, and in the meantime they put up some new buildings, so the skyline has changed, and I wanted to record that. I waited so long because there have been cranes in the skyline obstructing the view and whatnot, so I waited until the cranes were down, or thought I was. I got here this morning and found there's a crane. Morning. There is a movable crane still in the scene. Darn it. But maybe I can get lucky and spot it out in Photoshop. Anyway, how I was shooting this was with my GFX with a 250mm lens on it, which is way too long to get the whole skyline. But I wanted the detail, so I'm doing a panorama, multi-row panorama of, I think I did 4 rows, probably about 10 images each row, so 40 images thereabouts. I'll have to see when I get it in the computer. I wasn't really counting. But let me explain the setup here. So I've got a really right stuff pano head. I've never used this lens on this pano head before, so I'm guessing that, you know, because it's a 250mm lens, I probably don't need to worry that much about the nodal point. As you go wider, you do, but I have not tested the nodal point on this lens, so let's hope I got it right, or it turns out I'm right and I don't really need to care about it. But this allows me to tilt the head up and down and left and right over the center of the tripod, because I have a panning head on top of the tripod head. So I don't have to worry about the tripod being exactly level. I can level the tripod head, even if the legs are a little akimbo. And this allows me to do a multi-row pano pretty quickly and pretty easily. I've been using a Pixel wireless shutter release. So I move the head, take my hand off, click the shutter, move it to the next position, click the shutter. Before I started shooting, I did check and see what the field of view of the 250 lens was with regards to how far I should move it to provide some overlap between images, and was counting off. Turns out that 2 lines on the scale here is about perfect for the horizontal shift. On the vertical shift, I could go 3 lines on this scale. So that's how I was doing it. Figured out the far left and the far right area of the image that I wanted to capture. Odds are I'll crop it after it's all assembled, but we'll see how it looks. Let me see, I'm shooting at f11, ISO 100, shutter speed was a third of a second. A little bright on the right side to the east. Hopefully I can pull it in. Actually, let me check while I'm talking to you. Yeah, I'm a little bright in that sky. But that's a JPEG preview on the LCD, so hopefully in RAW I can pull it in a little bit. Otherwise I'll just crop the right side out. There is a tall building to the right that I'd like to maintain, but it's not really necessary. It's kind of separate from the rest of the downtown area. But the rest of the sky over downtown and to the left, to the west is pretty good. And that was the shot this morning. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning. I have to be in Richmond today anyway. So Took advantage of it. Guessed that I might have a sunrise. There were some clouds to the north, and this is pretty much how I'm facing. So I was hoping that they would light up as the sun came up. The horizon is clear to the east, so I got what I was looking for. Nice orange light on the clouds. I'll see how much I can bring that out in the final image. But yeah, it's been fun. I did break my HDMI cord. I have an Atomos Ninja V on top of the camera that I can't use now because as I was carrying all my gear here, I somehow leaned my arm against where that HDMI cord plugs into the camera. And I either broke the cord or I broke the HDMI plug in the camera itself. So we shall see. It's a little noisy here, as you may have noticed. I've got a rail yard behind me, and I got the river, or behind the camera, and I got the river in front of the camera, and some geese flying overhead. But yeah, great morning, great way to spend a morning. Hi. I thought I'd share with you how I created the image you just saw because I ran into some technical issues that were kind of interesting and I had never had to solve them before, even though I've done lots of multi-row panoramas in the past. So what you're seeing now is the collection of images that I shot. There's 55 of them, 5 rows, 11 images each. And what I did is I started out trying to assemble the panorama in Lightroom itself. So you select all the images, and then a trick that you do to tell Lightroom which image you want to base the geometry for the entire panorama in is to select the image that best represents where the camera and lens was level, neither pointing up nor down, or nor left nor right. So straight ahead and level, and that image is this one. And what you do is you select it after you've selected all the other images. So the frame in Lightroom shows up a little bit lighter. That is the most selected image. And that will tell Lightroom what to do, or what to base the geometry on. It'll start with that image and build the panorama around it using the rest of the images. So to do that, you go into Photo Merge, Panorama, and I want to do a spherical projection because it's a multi-row, a multi-column pano, so it's like it's on the edge of a sphere. And we'll see how this does. And this is what happens. Lightroom is, for some reason, not able to assemble the panorama. I don't know if it's because of the size, although I've created multi-row panoramas with more images than this in the past from the GFX. So maybe I didn't have as much overlap as I did in those previous images, so the total size of the multi-row panorama is too large for Lightroom. It could be something else. So what I did is to test this, I wanted to try it in Photoshop. So I exported each of the images as 1,000 pixel long images just to have some small files that I could play with and see what Photoshop would tell me. And I'll start another screen share or screen capture and go to Photoshop. And here's how you do a panorama in Photoshop. You want to do File, Automate, photo merge, browse to the files. This is the test. And then I mentioned there's a way in Photoshop, like in Lightroom, to tell Photoshop which image to use as the basis for the geometric render. And that is the last image in the list. So I need to, let's go back to Lightroom. I want to base the render on this image, and that's 1837. So if I go back to Photoshop, and I can't move 1837 in this list in any way. I can't drag it or anything, but I can remove it and add it again. So 1837, and now it appears at the bottom of the list. So this is going to be the image in which Photoshop will base the render of the entire multi-row pano. And you'll see this because it'll be the image that shows up when Photoshop starts assembling the panorama, and we'll show that now. There it is. And so Photoshop is going to take the rest of the images and build the full image around this. So let's see how that goes. So after a long time, this is what happens. Obviously Lightroom failed in the render because it couldn't figure out what to do with the sky, and neither could Photoshop. It's interesting, two of the images of the sky were able to be placed in the image because the top of the Federal Reserve building, that tall silver building, were in or was in those images. So it could figure that out. But the rest of the sky, because there was no cityscape and the clouds were so low contrast and soft, there was just no way it could figure out how to stitch it together. And this tells me that maybe shooting this scene with the 250mm lens was probably not the best idea, because the field of view was so narrow that when I was shooting the sky, I'm shooting just the sky, and the stitching software just can't figure out what to do with it. So then I started thinking, well, what can I do now? And I realized, well, it's stitching the rest of the image just fine. What if I stitch the top row that has Skyline in it, and then manually bring the pieces of the sky into that image and build up the image that way. So I'm doing the stitching with Photoshop's help. And so I did that. And I started out by going back to Lightroom and rendering the pano of just the row of the top row that had the city skyline in it. Saved that as a TIFF file. Brought that into Photoshop and expanded the canvas after taking the background layer and turning it into a true layer so that the canvas would be transparent instead of white. And then I was able to bring in the first of the sky images that had the tower in it, and align that image as close as I could. And then Photoshop, under the edit menu, when you select two layers, shows auto align layers and blend layers. And so and this is what Photoshop uses when it's creating a pano. It does each of those in turn. And what I found was that by aligning the layer, it wouldn't be perfect. There would be a little bit of a misalignment. But then by proceeding to the blend layer, apparently blend layer has a bit of alignment in it because it resolved all the alignment issues and completely removed the seams and color blended the images so that it was perfect. It was almost magical to see that happen. So I was able to do that with both of the images that had the tower. And then came the hard part. That was to bring in the individual sky images, figure out where they go, and I had to transform them myself because as the camera moves from left to right, right to left, you get some distortion. So it's rendering the scene on a three-dimensional curve, if you will, and so the sky images are going to get tweaked a bit in the render. So I had to do that myself. I had to piece the sky together, and I'll go through the whole process here as I'm talking so you can see it. And it was just a long, drawn-out process, but it worked really, really well. Get it close, and the blend function will take care of the rest. And then after the image was done, I just filled in the gaps along the edges with the spot healing brush tool with content aware fill, which was easy enough on the edge of the sky. And then after that, saved all of that. Had to save it as a large Photoshop document because it was over 4 gigabytes in size by that point. Went back into Lightroom, rendered the next 2 rows of cityscape, saved them out as TIFFs, and proceeded to let Photoshop stitch those 2 TIFF files into the large Photoshop document as a pano. And that's how I was able to put this together. It was a very long, arduous process, the hardest pano I've ever done. At the end, the full resolution file was over, it was my first gigapixel image. It was over 1 billion pixels, which is, twice the size that Lightroom will let you import a file at. So I had to reduce it in size and then bring it back into Lightroom to do the color adjustments and contrast and whatnot to finally make the image that you saw earlier. And I'll show it again here. But but I think it's worth it. I mentioned while I was shooting the scene that I was a little disappointed that there was still a crane in the skyline. But I realized that to a city, cranes represent progress. And so, maybe it makes sense to leave it in there. I'll see how people feel about it. It's definitely an image that I could probably sell to anyone who has an office in any of those buildings that are in the picture. So I'll show it around Richmond and see what kind of sales I can get out of it. But it was fun to do. It was the hardest pano I'd ever done, the largest pano I'd ever done. I'm not sure I'll use the 250 on another pano unless there's detail everywhere in the scene. No more skies, that's for sure. If I had chosen a wider image or wider lens like the 110 or the 120, or certainly the 63 would have done just fine. But as it was, I learned some stuff. First time I'd ever had to manually place pieces into the image and figure out how to get those to merge and align. Good to know that I can do it. So it'll come in handy if I ever find myself in another sticky situation. So I hope you enjoyed this brief tutorial. I hope it didn't bore you too much. And thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.